Welcome to Webster Speaks, dialogues on race, equity, and inclusion. I am your host, Vincent C. Flewellen, along with moderator Igho Ekakitie, coming to you from the Media Commons studio at Webster University in St. Louis, Missouri. It is Pride Month, and while there is much to be proud of, there's also much to fear. As the LGBTQ plus community is under attack, while this issue continues to unfold, let's examine this trend with our guests. LadyAshley Gregory is a community organizer and a reiki master who believes in healing through energy work. She is the grandniece of civil rights activist and St. Louisan writer Dick Gregory. Maxi Glamour is a multi-disciplinary performance artist based in St. Louis. They are the founder of Court, a local arts organization that advocates for intersectional queer liberation. Shira Berkowitz is Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy of Promo, Missouri, an advocacy group that confronts discrimination and oppression of the LGBTQ plus community. Welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us. First, an escalating culture war is targeting queer and trans young people, a very vulnerable group. A report by Williams Institute at UCLA Law School estimates that more than 54,000 transitioning youth are at risk of losing access to gender-affirming medical care. Care that their own medical experts say is essential for their physical as well as mental well-being. Shira, it appears that you gear up for some of the same legislative fight year after year, the same defensive strategy. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I work pretty specifically in the Missouri State Legislature about 6 months out of the year and doing analyses and trying to push a quite proactive agenda that would help protect the LGBTQ community the rest of the year. And we hope that we make headway. And for the past few years, we've seen a national attack on transgender youth that is much stronger than any kind of proactive strategy that we would like to take under the dome. And one of the most egregious pieces of legislation, and certainly the most dangerous and harmful that we've also seen pass in a couple of states, is this piece of legislation that aims to ban access to affirming health care that also saves lives for transgender youth under the age of 18. And we've seen it here in the state of Missouri for the past 3 years. We were really successful in being able to stop that legislation from moving forward this past year. But unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't matter whether or not the legislation itself moves forward. It's the rhetoric that leaks out of the policy realm, and it's the conversations that happen in communities and the fear that parents know about, and that kids know about, and that transgender adults feel. And there's when bills like that pass in other states, and people become afraid of whether or not DFS can come into their homes and arrest parents for just providing health care to their kids, that fear trickles out of the state into other states, and it's incredibly harmful. And that same Williams Institute report has also been expanded on by the Trevor Project, which is a national youth health crisis, both data service and helpline service, that has reported an uptick in youth that have sought their services since these bills and policies have been brought forward into the rhetoric around the nation since in the past couple of years.
Thank you. It's good to kind of frame that for us for the discussion. Some measures threaten to erase LGBTQ plus people altogether. Florida and Alabama passing laws against early education on gender identity, these so-called Don't Say Gay bills. Books are being banned. The idea is to basically just leave talks about gender and sexuality up to parents. But what's the real effect? Ashley?
You know
Lady.
me, Lady.
Ashley?
And I think the real effect is having youth and adults, not just youth, but adults growing up not knowing who they are. I would never say, don't say black, don't say teacher, don't say educator, don't say activist. Like, when we don't say who we are within our identities, we close ourselves off, we don't learn about ourselves, and we don't learn about each other. So I think as we continue to move forward, there's less knowledge about people as a whole. There's less knowledge about the paths that we go through and the struggles that we overcome to really be holistic human beings, because we're closing off parts of not just our identities, but other people's identities, and I think that's horrible. I think it's really bad, and I think it just makes us just really just not as bright as individuals and as human beings collectively trying to live.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maxi?
I just love that. I think it's really bad from Lady Ashley.
It's horrible.
I think, one thing about, it's a huge conservative talking point, is that, like, talking about oppression and talking about, like, the things that minorities are experiencing, they often say that's being divisive, just to talk about, like, what oppression is. And I think it comes from, like, some guilt of being the oppressor, of some guilt of being complicit and perpetuating this. And I think that it's probably it's a little controversial to say, but I think that it should be okay. It should be okay to kind of mess up and then learn and move forward. And I think that they're just not ready for that. I read recently that kind of like complex, not too complex, but like abstract thought of things that aren't palatable to their local community are so disconnected that they can't see how it's actually affecting their community. So in like rural communities and conservative communities, they don't have like a huge trans population, they don't have a huge black population. So to understand the complex situations of oppression that they face, it's crazy to them, because then they feel like it's being divisive, because then they feel like the bad guy and the oppressor, which they might be.
So it's so interesting, right? You think in terms of the dominant voice in culture, right? And then there's those of us who are marginalized in our identities, right? And our voices are then therefore a little bit more silenced, if not just totally shut off, right? And it's this idea of really kind of making space. I think is part of what I'm hearing you also say, is in terms of making space for the counter narrative, the counter voice that exists out there in spaces where in fact the majority reigns supreme in those conversations.
Exactly.
So before we continue our discussion, let's go to our person on the street segment. We call this Ego Trips, in which our moderator, Igho Ekakitie, asks the community about this year's Pride Month issues.
So the Don't Say Gay bill in general, like, I honestly, it's a lot that goes into that bill that I simply don't understand. There is conversation regarding Don't Say Gay because of parents being uncomfortable with their children having conversations about what their sexuality mean at such a young age. So that within, having children having the ability to know and say, like, this is what I feel is better for me. I think that conversation will always be hard, because, we grow up learning that children sometimes shouldn't make decisions for themselves. And ultimately, I think it should be an equal decision, a parent and the child actively having a conversation regarding their sexuality, regarding what their sexuality means to them. And if they don't know, that's okay. So do I agree with the bill? No, I do not. Do I understand the bill in its entirety? I do not. I think it's unfortunate that we have bills in place like this, because if we have bills that say freedom of speech, why should we have bills that say, well, you can't say certain things? Which is understandable. I know that conversation can go into a tangent of, well, people who believe in racism or make racist statements can say what they want. However, we know the outcome of that. So that bill is very difficult. I honestly just can't get behind that bill, or any bill like it. Again, ban books, don't say gay, the conversation regarding critical race theory being banned in classrooms as well. So I have many opinions regarding that bill.
Well, I don't know too much about, just all the issues that have been happening in Florida with the anti-LGBTQ laws, but I just hope that everybody's voice is just being represented as the way that they should, and I just want to make sure that everybody's voices are heard. So when they do have those laws, I just want to make sure that everybody's just represented the way they want to be, and their voices are heard, and just everybody's rights still continue to be protected, no matter what happens. So.
I think it's completely ridiculous, especially that there are over 238 bills that have been passed. In particular, I know there's one that limits the information that's taught in curriculum for schools, and I think that that's completely unnecessary because I think people should learn about other people in all aspects, because it goes back into the whole learning about Black history, learning about where your ancestors come from. I think everything should be incorporated into the school's curriculum because we all are humans and we learn about humans who came before us. So
yeah, so I think that they are just a little silly. My mom is actually an elementary educator and has been for the past 20 years. And I have to say, going through a public education system in Southern Missouri myself, it just seems a little ridiculous to insinuate that particularly any public education system is forcing children to be gay or turning your children gay. Children are much more advanced and much more able of high cognitive thought than we sometimes think they are. And presenting especially younger children with people who are different than them is really important in building well-rounded individuals. Specifically thinking of Webster, we love to think globally here. And I think it'd be really difficult to think globally if you had never met anybody who was different than you growing up, or never even learned about anybody who was different from you. And coming from somewhere that was more conservative, and growing up in that, I grew up in the Bible Belt and in Southern Missouri, it's pretty conservative, but being able to have people around me that were of all different backgrounds and walks of life and learning about things from their perspective is so important. And it also just is incredibly harmful to those children who are gay or identify anywhere on the LGBTQ spectrum, because it's making them feel like what they are, how they are as a person, is somehow wrong, and shouldn't be talked about, and that everybody should be celebrated. Everybody should get the chance to be themselves and be proud of who they are.
What are your reactions to what you've seen?
I think it's beautiful that we have these outlooks. I think a lot about our youth, and how I think even within learning environments, they're misguided. When children are born, they're unbiased. They don't have any hate. Their mindset is open to learn new things. And I really liked the first person. They said, I think these conversations between parents and children need to be equal. And I think so too. I think we take so much of youth's autonomy and telling them who they should be when some of our youngest kids are untouched by stereotypes. They're untouched by bias. And they know who they are. So I think if we give them a chance to speak and really grow into them, as adults and as older people, we can learn something too. And that's the type of parent I want to be. So I really appreciate the student who said that. Another thing that really rang true is they said, we need to get back to teaching about our ancestors and where people came from. And I think about how in schools we learn about the civil rights movement, and that gives us a chance to really learn acceptance. Most of the laws we have, most of the amendments that have been passed, they haven't been passed without a fight. The civil rights movement issued changes to the Constitution. So most of the major changes that we've had in society and civil rights, I am first a community activist. I found my voice from learning, from the Ferguson uprisings and in that environment. And I'm so grateful because that's when I see the push. That's when I see the move. When promo goes to Senate and they talk talk about things, like this is when things get done, from action, direct action. And I think we can't really forget that. So I think teaching those lessons, teaching that history so we don't repeat it, but more than anything, to learn about others' lived experience really teaches acceptance. Not necessarily, everybody can't walk a mile in someone else's shoes, but we can learn from someone else's story. And I'd rather be accepted than tolerated. And I think that's what these lessons teach us and what this education teaches us, being able to say gay and queer and trans expansive, I am as a youth, I am as an adult. I think that's what pushes us forward in society. So that's what I think.
Thank you.
Well, that was a full synopsis of everything. Just to look at that, I think that, if we look at the data, it shows that kids that learn about racism, learn about oppression, that they can dismantle those stereotypes that they have in their lives, and they can actually be able to go out in the world and navigate a non-homogenous culture. And that's really what we need, because I think a lot of people in power are let's just homogenize everything like milk. And I don't drink milk. That's it. I don't drink milk.
There's something, but there's probably something else, like coffee that's a little bit better for you, right? And you should be able to have something that's not milk.
Nice tea.
Yeah.
Nice tea.
It's beautiful. And I think when I was listening, I think very similar, yes, to everything that you mentioned about how kids should be able to say, I am, and that is incredibly valid. And from a policy perspective, what I think we're conflating, and everybody in the community in these videos is correct, that we are trying to create policies out of so much fear. They were like, we don't know what's in those policies. We don't know what was written in those bills. And I think the two powerful pieces are, one, our Don't Say Gay bill in Missouri is written in the critical race theory bans. So it isn't a standalone bill here. So that's even more of a indication of where we're at as a state of what is we are really fearing. We're really fearing racism. And then we're saying and those black trans women, we don't want them to be seen either. And we're trying to mitigate all versions of people or kids trying to learn about their visibility and trying to eradicate the visibility that children have to be seen in their classrooms. And it comes from, I think we all grew up in this era where our teachers, to some perspective, unless they were young, knew about the lavender scare and the lavender laws, where it was illegal to be gay and it was illegal to say that you had a partner, and you could lose your government job. So nobody was. And we're almost at this point of wanting to recreate and push people back into that anti-visibility space, because we have so much visibility around us and so much pride, and kids that are demanding about, they know who they are. We want to be seen, and we want to not go back into a space where we don't have access to that, and lots of fear and then fear mongering around trying to limit and go backwards. And we know the harms of that, both from the civil rights era policies that we were trying to take away, and from policies on the book like the lavender laws.
The Don't Say Gay bills, if they're followed to the letter of the law, if you think about the fact that, a Mrs. Smith can only then talk about her spouse, not her husband, right? Because that then indicates something about orientation.
Her sexual orientation.
Her sexual
Exactly.
orientation, right? So the idea was that, come up with these laws that would quiet these LGBTQ plus folks from not being able to talk about their sexual orientation. But in fact, now the heterosexuals also are now going to, if we in fact are following this.
But laws aren't followed, and they're almost mute to a point. I don't follow the law, I mean, I follow the law, just joking. I definitely follow the law. But I think the law works for certain people and works against certain people.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that to be true, right? I mean, you look at any criminal courthouse system and you start looking at the racial disparities that exist there, right? So we know that to be true. But what I think that's really interesting on this piece is that it's being written by heterosexuals with the intent of silencing those of us within this community, when in reality, if in fact that law it silences them as well.
I think that's the problem with so much of the policy that is rooted in a misunderstanding of who trans people are, who queer people are, who LGBTQ plus people are. It's written in a way that is trying to mitigate one homogenous person's fear. And they're forgetting all of the loopholes and all of the problematic inquiries that would really be doing much more destruction than solving any kind of fear. They're just looking for solutions to problems that aren't there.
Lady Ashley?
You know, it makes me think about our existence. And you said someone's going to find a way. And I think when people really realize that this stops them where they are, like you say, Mrs. Hamilton's are only allowed to talk about her spouse versus her husband. That person is a part of her. Like, that's her family. And the fact that she cannot openly talk about her husband as a husband, those characteristics of her identity, that beats her down. I think of community organizer in his community and just kind of activists and gurus. Oh gosh, why am I forgetting the name? Sadhguru. And he says your happiness is directly related to your health. And I think about people coming into their identities, people coming into knowing who they are, people knowing who they come from, who they're married to. They take pride in that. You know, people have fought to be married, black and brown people too, queer and trans people, they fought to be married. So those relationships are a part of their identity. And if they can't claim those as their own, they're not directly happy. And that's why we see so many movements coming from the everything from Stonewall to marriage equality. We see people fighting, and the people who want to exist, they're going to find a loophole. They're going to continue to fight for it. So that's what I appreciate in hearing that.
Shira, you've talked about showing lawmakers the human toll of anti-LGBTQ plus bills that affect our young people. Is it actually working?
I believe so. I might be a far gone optimist, but I believe that when we bring one thing we do is we bring like very young trans children who, right, at this point in their lives of 7 and 8 year old children, right, they have no medical intervention in their bodies. They're just wearing clothes that make them feel really good about who they are. They're going by a name that makes them feel very empowered to be called on. And when they're sitting coloring in an office while I'm talking with a lawmaker and they just happen to see this kid and be proud to be trans, I think it makes a huge difference because they see this likeness to their own kid, their grandkid, their nibbling, their niece and nephew, whomever it is that they can see. They're like, I'm harming my kid, like I'm harming a kid. And I think it's starting to make a huge difference.
So what I'm hearing you also say there is that it's not just I'm harming a kid. I'm harming a kid with whom I have kinship.
Yes.
Right, with whom I have relationship.
Yeah.
Do you think, in fact, that is where some of the greatest work and strife can be done, is when we have that friendship, that kinship, that relationship?
I do. So I think it's way outside of the law. I think it's in our communities, it's in our neighborhoods, it's in our own families. It's having those really hard conversations with our families, but it's also just like being that visible queer neighbor that's willing to have a conversation with your other neighbor and crossing that bridge and saying like, you don't want to harm me and I don't want to harm you, and look at how great of friends we are. So it does wonders. I hope, I believe. Okay. Right, we live in Missouri.
Right, show me state.
Yes.
So despite some of the challenges for the community, we have not been able to erase gay and gender non-conforming people from our culture. There's a slew of affirming books for young people, representation in the media. As a performer, Maxi, do you see an increase on the horizon?
As in like gender non-conforming people existing or within the performance world, or both?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I saw a survey recently and it shows, I think it was, I don't know, I'll make up the number. It's 65% of kids like know someone that's queer or trans.
A lot.
You know, a lot of kids know trans folk. And I think that, you know, they have the terminology, they have the words that I didn't have when I was a kid, you know, and I'm like, wishful. That I wish I could be like a kid 15 years from now. Because while there are all these bills and there are all these scares and moving backwards, the people that are going to be running the country in 15 years, they're woke, you know? At least a majority of them. They have the tools. They have TikTok. They're connected. It's people that are disconnected that are just like, well, we don't understand, so we're going to control you until you push us out. And hopefully, you know, I'm also optimistic.
I believe that is going to happen. In
Yeah.
20 years, these are
15.
15.
10.
15. 15.
Let's just do it next year. Let's just do it next year. But yeah, I think that it will happen, hopefully.
I think we even see it like with apps like Instagram that are now automatically asking what your pronouns are next to your name. You know, when I've gone to job interviews even more recently, or I've done conversations with people, I have more folks introducing me with their pronouns and asking me my pronouns, and I used to have to be proactive about that with others, and now I can tell people, wow, this means so much to me. Thank you so much for making this a part of that conversation. I'm seeing it more than ever, and I love it.
You know, I think it's so interesting when you say that in terms of the pronouns. Here at Webster University, it's very much a part of, we've changed our own policies, right, to now include in applications, pronoun is a part of it from the very beginning, right? And so as a student, as a faculty, as a staff member applies, we know up front that preferred or chosen pronoun, and likewise with our chosen name policy. It's on the front side. You have to be very intentional about that. So we're excited about that. But
how often can students change that? Because identities are like fluid, and you know, like.
So that's what's so great about it. It's a simple. You go into your what we call My Connections, and there's a space where you can go and control your profile and your data and all of that.
I love that.
Yeah,
So nice.
It is. And so, you know, day one, right? The professors, you know, you're in class and, you know, the roster, it's already out there, right? And you think about some of our students or even our colleagues who are in the process of transitioning, right? And so you don't have to raise your hand and say, you know, but I have this other name, or, you know, the embarrassment is there, the shame, all of that has been removed, right? And that we're creating policies and ways in which you can show up day one and really be yourself.
How does it work with like the federal paperwork? Because I know a lot of it is very
great
binary.
question. Very great question. So this is just internal. In some instances, you know, if you have not had the legal change, you know, your diploma may not reflect that, right? And this is particularly true for many of our international students. Diplomas actually in other countries are, the actual diploma has greater value than, say, a transcript may. And so in those instances, we have to work really closely and make sure that they're clear about, well, while here, this is what we can do. When you return home, that's another story, so to speak. But much of it is a practice that we have here for campus during your time with us, so to speak.
I just know as a student, like I'm in school now, and just like applying for all that paperwork, and it's like dead name, male, dead name, male, you know, that's the way it goes in college sometimes. So I'm really happy that you guys are trying to make an effort.
And I appreciate that you're trying to make an effort, right? Like we stumble at times, and you know we come back. I think of Susan, who was a student. She is the one who brought the need to my attention. She's the one who said, yes, I will serve as, you know, as the experiment for you in terms of making sure all the multiple systems of a university all communicate, right? And so just because you change a form here does, you know, making sure that it, public safety, to the library, to the registrar's office, to the bursar's office, to the academic affairs office, right? And so there are times in which we have messed up, right? And just ask for grace and forgiveness and a commitment to do better.
I love messes because you have to learn how to clean them up and prevent them.
That's
so it's
right.
beautiful.
That's
Or
right.
just make bigger ones. It's my motto.
Talk about the need for healing and energy work in the intersectional community, Lady Ashley.
Well, I first have to say that I'm very cautious about how I use the word intersectional. I often think of, like, what would Miss Kimberly Crenshaw do, knowing that that word was originally created for women who identify as Black in the prison system? So I try to say not intersectional, but intertwining, or I try to find another word. And I think so many of us grow up with different backgrounds. I think of promo in my previous work where we took pride in storytelling, to pass stories down, to get laws passed. I think of my experience with Reiki, with energy work, using universal energy and the energy of the sun. Everything is not always cured by prescriptions. Doctors don't always have the best remedy, except for, especially for Black and brown, and queer and trans expansive people. So I hope that we continue to learn about other people's fights, the parts of our identities that intertwine maybe without using the word intersectional, but see how we create. And that's one thing that I love about language, is how it changes. Specifically with the trans expansive community and with the LGBTQ plus community, we've always come up with new names to express ourselves. I have friends that have created new pronouns, and I think as long as we continue on that path, we'll be able to grow and emerge, and also acknowledge how we're different and hold that with like a sacred type of inspiration. As we continue to move on through our lives, we'll become our own individual people, but become more of a community that understands each other. So I think that's what's really important, is looking at alternative forms of learning, alternative forms of healing. And as a community healer who's talked to other community healers and created a network of that, I've seen how important it is. But yeah, I really just want to stress how I try to get away from the term intersectional unless it really applies to the people who it was created for. I try not to make it an umbrella term. So that's really, really important for me. Yeah.
I appreciate that, as I've edited my next question. Anybody else have a thought on any of that, though? I think
I've never heard that. Like, I knew that what Kimberly Bradshaw wrote books about, and I knew, but I never thought of the word specifically for that. Like, I look at semantic drift, and I think of like how words change meaning to be like applicable for like different things. And I often use it to like talk about like queer identities and like Black identities or like immigrant identities together. But I never really thought of it like taking away or kind of being reductive in a way of like the author's original intent of the word.
Yeah. Cool. I love to think about that, and I love to like think outside of things, because I think it's just so crucial to see how Black women have been affected in the prison system, and just see how that changes, and especially as laws change. As right now we're voting in Missouri whether to legalize marijuana, to see how this really affects like
It's not legal?
In some places it is. In some places it is, but it's not. There are not petitions, but I have canvassers going around now to vote to do other things with it, especially to make it more legal, which will decriminalize it. And if we look at the prison industrial complex, the majority of people who are in jail for cannabis-related infractions, they're Black and brown people. So I think that's really important to see how that really affects them.
What do you see as the future of the LGBTQ plus community as it relates to intertwining? Shira?
Oh, all right. That question, I think, and also in collaboration with the last question, I think that there has been, our community is one that has often been, one, so dispersed, so pocketed. And in all of those pockets, in all of those like separate identities, if we were only to look at it from like one microcosm of just how we identify in our sexuality, or just our gender identity, or just our gender expression, and then didn't put any other identity at all, we have been oppressed by the government in just that canon, in all of those ways. And so I think that we have a lot of healing work to do in all of those disparate realms. And I think, so healing work of bringing the community together and recognizing the histories that come along with all of our intertwining identities. I really love this. And then also in the offensiveness that is just being left behind and also offended in policy work to claim space for ourselves in our place of origin, our state, our country, our cities, is really messy. And so I think that the future looks like a lot of holding space for healing, and how to find our collective joys without further oppressing ourselves amongst ourselves.
I love that. This is a conversation we can go on with for days. I would like for us to end. We've talked about fight, right? And fight is very much a part of our community in so many ways, fighting to be seen, fighting to be recognized,
Fighting each other.
fighting to live, fighting each other. Talk a little bit about that really quickly. What do you mean by that?
You know, sometimes you just gotta put them gloves on. You know, there are queer people that are racist. There are queer people that are sexist. There are most gay men are misogynistic, and I'm just gonna put that out there. We don't got the statistics of how many numbers. We're just gonna say a lot. And I think that it shows up in the queer community. If you know, you go to a circuit party and you are an AFAB person in there, you're gonna be completely ignored or scoffed and looked at like, why are you here? You know, I think that there's this hyper-homogenized identity within pockets of communities. And I think that, you know, this cis, white, male-dominated culture permeates through queer culture, and there's a lot of fighting, and we're not done. Get them gloves out.
That's a whole nother show, and one that I would absolutely love to have, because again, as a black gay man, there are times in which I actually find some of my most difficult conversations are with white gay men. And it's the racism piece that pops in there often, I find. But let's end on a positive note. What do we find, what are ways in which, or what are elements of which you take joy and find joy in being a member of the community?
You know, for me, like St. Louis, I'm a hometown girl, and I think just going out and being able to see a familiar face at the coffee shop, give someone a hug. It's being in community. There's always in St. Louis, there's a lot of free things to do, I think, which is really important around the performing arts, which is really great. But I always love how, especially for me being like a city folk, I can always go somewhere, whether it's the botanical gardens or like I said, a local coffee shop or the science center or a store, and just see a familiar face that I know. And that's how you know that you're building community. People who are in places and they don't see anybody they know or anything that they recognize. I think that's a testament to like where you grow up. But St. Louis is definitely one of those cities where you can always see a familiar face if you're relaxing on a Wednesday night at a free concert at the Botanical Gardens. And that's what I really love. So that's how I find joy. I often say I found my home in people before I found it in a place. St. Louis is really racially divided, and I think when you're involved in community activism and other forms of nonprofit and even the educational systems, you're able to see that. So knowing that I've been able to build a community where people gave me a home within themselves first, I think that's where I find joy. Also reading, and a chapter in the book Braiding Sweetgrass and Nation of Immigrants, I think kind of like expresses that. So before I found myself a home in a place, I found it in a city, and St. Louis has been that city for me for all of my life. So yeah.
Chancellor Strobel loves that book.
It's a good book.
I love that book.
And by that, I want to be clear. In the joy of being a part of the LGBTQ plus community, right? Like, what's that joy there for us?
I've been in the community, like I've been partying and like the club and nights that I've seen since I was 14. That's been 4 years, you know? And, you know, I've seen the community grow. At this point, I've like read to kids and now they're like pre-teens. Like
in
I read
drag,
to,
by the way.
Yeah, I read to them in drag when they're like 4 or 5, and then now they're like 12. And they like at parades, they're like
9, 8.
I'm really bad at math, you know? I look good, I am not good at math. But yeah, 9. And it's like kids in elementary school have seen me grow up, and they're like, now I'm 21 and I can come to your show, or this is the first drag show that I've ever been. Or sometimes they're like, hey, thank you for showing me that like black queer culture is not monolithic, that you can be weird, that you can be like super freaking gay and not a bad bitch, you know, and be something of your own uniqueness. And I think that really being that person and learning how to pass the torch, I think that's my next step.
You're so old.
I am.
When you all think about it, though, and I don't want to interrupt, but how we all didn't meet each other to first start off with, like in work-related instances. Like Maxi and I, we met out partying. Shira and I, we've met at community events, and so that's what I talk about. And we're all like fabulously queer. And I know you from way back, way back. And that's what I mean about seeing a familiar face, Mr. Mr. Flew. Like I went to high school and I knew Mr. Flewellen, and so now when he was saying somebody knows me because of my identity and that gives someone a space, like he's always been that person, but these are the familiar faces that I'm talking about in community. Like this is it.
Just us?
No, there's more. There's more.
Thank you. Shira?
I totally agree with that. I love the queer community here. I absolutely adore it. And it's one of the best things that gives me my own acceptability of who I am and get to be, because there's people who I surround myself with that are just so passionate about being themselves. And I see it everywhere. So it's great.
I love and find great joy in the fact that voices today are much more amplified and louder than ever. And I am so proud. You talk about passing the torch. I feel as if, to look and to see students on campus today, to see, who unapologetically live their lives as they have decided that they want to live their lives. I love that. I love the creativity. I love the arts, the freedom, the expressions, all of who we are. And I think it's what we should find great joy in this month of June and celebrating.
Every month.
And every month. Every month. And so I want to thank you all for this enlightening conversation and your time today. And I would like to as well thank our audience and our sponsors for joining us. This broadcast will be available on demand at webster.edu/Webster Speaks. Again, it's webster.edu/Webster Speaks. Thank you and have a good day.